Thanks for the introduction, Jen. She's in love with my kids, so as am I. Today I'll be talking about, a story of a journey towards conservation solutions and the successes and the challenges and the rocky points and some of the other spin-offs along the way, I guess. So on today, in this hottest day of April for the state, we're also in the driest state of the driest continent, and I'm taking you north to the arid zone where it's drier still. This area here near Roxby Downs is actually the driest part of the country, and it has a very particular, very fragile ecosystem as a result that's adapted over millennia to those conditions. But that's symptomatic of a much wider area. Australia's arid zone is truly enormous and makes up most of the continent. So conservation in this area is a very, very significant concern because it's such a large space and a huge component of the global biodiversity. And at risk, a very familiar story to all of you, I'm sure, the major risks operating presently on the mammal biodiversity, particularly in this region, are invasive species, starting with the rabbit, which invaded, was the first species to turn up, and a major consumer of vegetation, and also a major supporter of these predators that are great rabbit eaters, and they inflate the numbers of feral cats and foxes in the landscape by being a huge food source for them. So these are the challenges operating, and here's the sad story. I've selected a range of species that used to occur in our area near Roxby Downs. The animals on the left-hand side are still persistent, and they represent about the 40% of species that remain in that area. But in the last 100 years, 60% of the species have disappeared, and around 21% of those black circles permanently disappeared. In fact, one of them, this one on the bottom left, is a pig-footed bandicoot. It's a species that fascinates me, and I have a good friend who works in a natural history museum, and his theory is that the pig-footed bandicoot might have been evolving to become a marsupial ungulate with hooves, which is a challenging thing for a group of animals that need to have grasping hands to climb from the birth canal into the pouch, to then go back to having a hoofed foot, but we'll never know because it's gone. Fortunately though, and really by a stroke of luck, those animals in the middle are still with us. They went extinct from the mainland, or have grossly contracted from where they used to be. And many of them have survived on offshore islands just by a quirk of fate. So we are fortunate, and that presents an opportunity to bring some of them back. And that's the start of the Arid Recovery story. I've only been with Arid Recovery for a couple of years after a longer association going back a bit. But it was all started by this couple, John Reid and Katherine Moseby, who may be familiar to some of you. John was the environmental guy at the Olympic Dam mine in the 80s and could see some of the devastation around him in the arid zone, and particularly was concerned about rabbits. When the Khaleesi virus came through in the 90s, he saw an opportunity to actually fence rabbits out completely from an area, and in doing so exclude feral predators as well. And then that's evolved into doing reintroductions and general ecosystem restoration. And he's very much supported by his talented wife, Katherine Moseby. And these other co-founders, Peter Copley from the State Department here, has been a really major part of the organisation right through, and also Professor David Payton from Adelaide University. He's up with us right now doing a field school with 30-odd students up there. And the first step was to fence out the ferals. So this is the Arid Recovery fence. It's a simple idea really, and in the initial stages it underwent some rigorous testing with feral cats put inside a pen with different designs to see how long it would take them to get out, and if so, how, until a design was tweaked to keep them in. That's the first cat that was stopped by the design, and the key part is this curvy top. We call it a floppy top. It's loose, it's wobbly, and even if cats can leap onto it, they can't get the purchase to get over it. And it's really effective. The reserve was built in stages with much volunteer effort. It's been expanded from the initial area down the very bottom there of 14 square k's to 123 square kilometres. And the fact that it's built into separate compartments, although those lines going through the middle are internal fences, creates this fabulous experimental option. It's essentially a landscape experiment space, so we can apply different treatments in different parts of the reserve, different mixes of species, and measure the response. And that's been really important for us to understand how these arid ecosystems work, how they interact with these reintroduced species, and a whole host of other things I'll mention later. The next stage, after getting the ferals out of the fenced area, which was actually no mean feat and took several years, was to bring back some of these animals. And the first to come in 98 were the greater stick-nest rats. These came from an island off Port Lincoln, and the population now at Arid Recovery is the most significant one on the mainland, and a major contributor to the global population size for that species. Stick-nest rats are really relatively large native rodents, and they build these fantastic, maybe 4 metres across sometimes, 1.5 metres high, nests out of sticks, and they'll live in those for generations. The next animal was the burrowing bettong in 99. These animals had survived on islands off Shark Bay in Western Australia, and we brought them back in with around 30 individuals, and they've done very well. I'll mention them in a minute. And then also we brought back greater bilbies from a breeding program in Monarto. And bilbies there's something a bit special about bilbies because they have actually persisted on the mainland, albeit in greatly reduced range to what they used to occupy. But they've clearly got something going on that's working, and we're endeavouring to understand what that is, and can we apply that to other species potentially. Finally, the western barred bandicoot was brought over in 2001, again from Shark Bay. It turns out the bandicoot we introduced didn't actually occur here. In the end, it's been recently split into multiple species, but those other newly discovered species are well and truly extinct. So it's good to have this bandicoot. And there's this sneaky guy. This is a plains mouse, and it's fairly rare throughout the arid zone compared to what it once was. And as a calicivirus reduced rabbit numbers and also reduced cat and fox numbers in the arid zone, the plains mouse has started to spread back out and reoccupy country, and it turned up of its own accord in the Arid Recovery Reserve in 2006. And it's filthy with them now. They're everywhere, and because they can move through the fence, they're spreading out into the surrounding landscape. So the fence is essentially seeding that landscape with plains mice, which is pretty cool. We haven't had to lift a finger. Throughout the program, we've had intensive monitoring of these reintroduced species and the general ecosystem. This is some example of the track count data we've collected over the years. Some of you might have seen Georgie's talk yesterday about the power of simply counting tracks as a monitoring method. And this shows that there's a meteoric rise in bettongs. They've done very, very well. Bandicoots too, and a lot of these animals, particularly the insectivorous ones like bandicoots, fluctuate incredibly dramatically according to seasonal conditions. So you can see that, but generally they're doing fairly well. And this is a little cameo story about the role some of these animals are contributing to the ecosystem out there. That hole there is a bilby dig. Bilbies dig quite deep, pointy holes, and they're essentially little composting machines because they dig these holes that collect leaf litter and moisture and seeds, and as a result they've actually increased the carbon and nitrogen content in the soil. That graph there shows that inside a bilby dig there's double the amount of carbon compared to the surface soil, and that facilitates germination of seedlings. So in the first 10 years of the fence being up, we've seen an increase in native cypress pine recruitment, mulga recruitment, as a result of this kind of activity, which is pretty cool. And I suppose bilbies are effectively sequestering carbon, you could say. So there you go. So that's where we're at the moment, and I guess Arid Recovery has had a coming of age as it's come into 21 years this year, and conservation is never a simple matter, and we've started to grapple with some of the complexities that are thrown up, and when you're effectively modifying ecosystems by building fences and reintroducing animals, it presents all sorts of challenges, and by being that agent that's modified the system, we have a pretty extreme responsibility to continue to manage that. So I'll talk you through some of the challenges and some of the bigger issues. Well, one is simply just keeping a fence up. This is after some rain we had last Christmas when, we found that the soil got very, very soggy and the fence got a bit of a lean on it, and this sort of thing happens all the time. Metal rusts, and the reserve has 80 kilometres of fencing. That takes a lot of maintenance, and we're working towards a more sustainable strategy with that. But the other issue with fencing more broadly is the Arid Recovery Reserve at the moment is the largest of its kind in Australia, but it's still a tiny little blip on a massive landscape, and as a conservation solution, it's an important one, a really important interim measure, but can it be the ultimate solution? I don't believe so, and that's what we're moving towards, working out solutions for some of these vulnerable species outside of fences, and it could be a very long game, but you've got to get started. The other issue we're grappling with is the extremely successful burrowing bettongs. There's a whole lot of them coming in to drink around a tap. So from the 30 individuals first introduced, there are now around 6,000 in the reserve, and that's having an impact. So I'll just talk you through that quickly. This plant here is the ruby saltbush, a succulent, and the orange line marks the cover that we've estimated for that plant within the reserve over the years, and the blue is the abundance of bettongs. And so there's a clear decline, a clear inverse trend there, and bettongs are great generalist feeders. They can live off bark if they have to in the dry times, and they're probably quite good at competing with other species for food, and they like eating saltbush. And that's a problem potentially for the stick nest rat, which is much more specialist in its feeding. It really likes succulent salt bushes, and we've seen this trend that seems to be fairly closely linked to the rise in bettongs, which is again in blue, and the orange is the stick nest rat activity. And at around the point that the ruby saltbush cover declined to a very minimal value, the stick nest rats declined also. So we're concerned about that species and the impact of bettongs, and simply on fostering a balanced ecosystem. I'll talk about what we're doing about it later. One of the other challenges we found that by enclosing animals in a large fenced area, but it's still a fenced area with very few predators, is that they lose their smarts. And we've attempted on a few occasions to reintroduce bilbies and bettongs outside of the fence, and they've always failed. They've always ended up like that. We've even tried to address the issue of these animals not having prior exposure to predators by chasing them with stuffed cats and spraying them with a bottle of cat urine to get the message that cats are scary, and it did work for a little while, but the message didn't stick. So again, I'll talk about the new tack we're taking there in a minute. But more broadly, I guess, to gear up for looking outside of the fence and taking advantage of what we have established, we've separated the compartments of the reserve into a core conservation zone where we're maintaining populations of these vulnerable species and continuing to monitor them, and an experimental zone. Because it's fenced, it allows us to test in a controlled way some new ideas and to simulate outside the fence situations. So we've divided it up that way. Okay, going back to the bettong issue, having too many bettongs, and I'll just touch on some of the things that we're trying to tackle there, and we're very much in the middle of this at the moment. We're doing some research with collaborators to trial contraceptives as a method. It may not be feasible on our scale, but it seems to be somewhat effective, and I hope it will be useful for other groups elsewhere. We've generated these little one-way gates, which is essentially a cat flap, but it's a one-way exit to allow these animals to disperse. But because they've been confined, their natural processes would have been to disperse, and this allows them to do so. but it's very much contingent on us doing some very intensive predator control around the reserve to give the bettongs the best chance we possibly can. And we're working with some researchers from Melbourne Uni to understand how that's going. And finally, in next month, we'll be introducing a native predator. And really, this is the ideal solution because we hope that they'll be able to regulate the herbivores of their own accord. So in May, we'll be releasing the Western quoll. We're bringing 10 individuals from Western Australia over and taking 2 from the Flinders Ranges. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens. So watch that space. Right, so looking outside the vets again, the main problem that these animals have to tackle if they are to survive outside are feral cats and foxes and other predators. So we've really invested a lot of time in researching better ways to manage that threat. So things like testing baits, aerial deployment of baits for cats, that's something we've been part of. Profiling cats and understanding which cats are the greatest threat. So the image up there is the stomach contents of one cat over a night's hunting, but it's extremely variable. So one cat might have eaten 20 lizards, another one will have eaten 1 rabbit. So we're trying to profile which are the problem cats and are there ways we can target them. That's very much Catherine Mosby's work. We've been testing these new devices. That's John Reid there with his Felix grooming traps. We've just done a big test of those within the reserve to prove how effective they are, and as he moves towards commercialisation of these traps, which are a pretty smart, very targeted feral cat control method, which could be really useful in the toolkit. Right, but one of the real challenges, as much as we might be able to control feral predators outside of fences, one of the bigger challenges is the animals themselves. That many of these species have been isolated on offshore islands without even native predators for a very, very long time. And while somewhere deep in the back of their brainstem, surely they should have some memory of what it is to be terrified of being eaten, it's very evident that they lack that at the moment. If you ever come to Arid Recovery and meet some bettongs, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. They're very friendly, which is delightful. But it's a real problem for their future. So rather than chasing animals with stuffed cats, we've actually taken the tack of exposing them to the real thing in a controlled situation. So we've actually put bettongs and bilbies in with feral cats in one of those experimental parts of the reserve so that they can learn to coexist. And it's in a controlled fashion because it's contained. We can manage the number of cats and monitor it very closely on a monthly basis. And that allows us to expose these animals to the very direct threat. Some of the bettongs will be chased by cats, they'll have a near miss and learn a valuable lesson, some will be eaten. So there'll be some level of natural selection applied to the population over time, we hope. And it's early days yet, but we're seeing some behaviour change in the bettongs. They're more wary where they've lived with cats, they're more vigilant, and they'll run away faster as you approach them. So that's encouraging, but more importantly, we've actually seen them coexisting with cats over 3 years, and the bettong population in that time has more than doubled. So that gives us a fair bit of hope, but it could still be a long game. So we'll see. We'll see where we go. But, that's the roadmap for the future, and I'll just finish by saying that Arid Recovery's contribution, I guess, to the state and the country in terms of training up young conservationists has been really quite large. They've had over 250 students come through in one shape or form over the years, and lots of interns and volunteers, and many of these people go on to do great work. So it's wonderful to be part of that community, and I look forward to much more of it.